Neil had liked, I think particularly liked Made in Britain, which was one film in a quartet of films that I'd written for television about young people and education. And they simply said, oh, we like Made in Britain, have a read of this. And they gave me a treatment for Mona Lisa, which was on an A4 piece of paper, and it took up that much space. So it was very succinct. It was just a very, very simple outline. Man comes out of prison, he's been in prison for 12 years, he's completely out of touch, and he gets a job driving for a hooker, a prostitute. It was as simple as that. The major difference between that, the treatment, and the brief that I was given, and the end result, was that they told me at that time that the main character was to be played by Michael Caine. So when I wrote my first draft, I was very much writing around the Michael Caine I had in my head. And it was only once I then finished that draft. It's here. I actually found the first draft. This is the typewritten draft, which written on a typewriter, because I can see all the places I've inked out my terrible typing. Neil then took my draft and rewrote it. That was always the deal. He said, you write a draft, then I'll do it, then I'll give it back to you, then I'll do it. And we had that arrangement. What actually happened was that Neil would get 2/3 of the way through his draft and then give it back to me and say, well, what do you think of it so far? So I would read his draft and give it back to him after a conversation. We'd talk about it. Then he'd go, oh, well, I'm going to have another go at it. So Neil would have a go. And that's how it worked all the way through. I never wrote any more. I never wrote another draft after that. And it was all based on what Neil wrote from then. And I was very much involved in that process. There were long gaps because he would go away and simply write. And there were weeks. And then out of the blue, another draft or 2/3 draft, 3/4 draft would show up, and we'd meet and have cups of tea or go and have a really nice meal, Neil, myself and Steve, and talk about it. And that's how it evolved. And I think that if there was I think one of the sticking points, certainly for me in terms of the draft, was that it was very difficult to find an ending, and I think that was one of the reasons that Neil would get 2/3, 3/4 of the way through a draft, because he couldn't see that end point. He couldn't see the finishing line of the piece, and I think that was a difficulty. And somewhere in that process, the main character changed. From, in terms of actor, to change from being Michael Caine. I suspect probably because Michael Caine wasn't prepared to give the amount of time it would have been needed to play the leading role, to becoming Bob Hoskins, which I think made the film. I think it would have been a very different film, a darker film, if Michael Caine had played the main part. And I think that was reflected in my original screenplay. My draft didn't have, in the way in which Neil's screenplay had, was the gradual burgeoning of a hopeless relationship, of him becoming emotionally attached to this Mona Lisa figure, this woman on whom he projects his idea of what a woman should be, his idea of a kind of woman he would fall in love with. And that wasn't in my script. It was implied, I think, but it wasn't in any way overt in the way in which it is in the finished film. And it was very much about pursuing the Mitchum character, then in my head the Michael Caine character on the street, and him catching up with how things had changed during the time he spent 12 years in jail. I think in my script somebody says to him, he said, "What was your sentence?" He said, 12 years, 5 and 7. I did 5 and 7. He said, "What was the 5 for?" He said, "I shot a man in the leg." He said, "The 7, I shot him in the other leg." So it was in that kind of dark, black humour tone all the way through that I wrote, and I think that was in there. And I think it's in there, especially in the early stages of the film, that you see that in Bob Hoskins' performance. If there was any kind of clash of temperament or writing styles and taste between Neil and myself, then I think it was a positive one, because I think as Neil wrote more, I was playing devil's advocate to what he had written, and I never referred back to my draft. In fact, I had not read my draft of Mona Lisa since I wrote it until yesterday, when I knew I was going to do this interview. I'd not read my draft, and I was quite surprised by it, because there was a lot more in my draft that's there in many different ways inside the film than I'd ever thought in the intervening years, and that's a lot of years. I can see how the two screenplays are related. There are ways that Neil writes and things that he puts into script that came up during the course of the development of his drafts that I thought, where's he got that idea? Why does he want to do something like that? A good example of this is when, in the early stages of the film, he stops at a pet shop and buys a rabbit. And I just said, why has he stopped to buy a bloody rabbit? What's this rabbit thing? Oh, I like the idea that he stops and buys a rabbit. And I just thought, I don't get that. But it's an incredible non-linear device, and it's a good example that in the development of a story where I would turn right, Neil turns left, and I've experienced that with him since then when we worked on the Borgias together. He has, I think it's a poetic element that he puts imagery and ideas into his screenplays that are not logical, are not linear, but add a real element of charm, magic even. And I learned that from Neil Jordan. That's something I learned from him in working on Mona Lisa. I think there is a poetic magic element in the film. It's called Mona Lisa, and the theme song is very romantic, and Nat King Cole's songs were all very romantic. And I think one of both Neil and Stephen's reservations about what I had written was that it was too hard-edged. It was too violent in some ways. It was too much of the street. And in the film, even when he shoots things like Goodsway, where all the prostitutes hang out in King's Cross, which was a real location. I had put that into my screenplay, and that carried on. But the portrayal of Goodsway, as you see it in the film, is very unreal to my mind. It's more like Hades. I would drive through Goodsway on a regular basis because I lived near King's Cross at the time. And it was never like that, and a lot of the time you didn't even know prostitutes were working on Goodsway day or night, except you'd see a couple of women on a street corner. So I think that's a heightened reality within the film that is in there, and it's all part of Neil's vision as a filmmaker, as a film director and writer. And for me, it was always a positive experience and remains so. I first saw Bob Hoskins acting in what was called the Ken Campbell Roadshow, which was a group of actors who went around to theatres and pubs doing a show. And one of the turns in the show was an attempt at the world record for how much time you could spend with a ferret down your trousers. And that's where I first saw Bob, because they used to put a real ferret down the trousers. I can't remember if Bob was ever the recipient of that, but he was in that, and he portrayed a great comic ability, and that's visible in the film, particularly the early parts of the film, where he has a chirpy, witty, cynical side to his character, which I think reflects something that I had put into the original screenplay. There's a lot of sharp lines in the screenplay, so it's great, and it also gave him as a performer an evolution in terms of the character, because there's a harsh moral side to him as well, because the world has changed. It says that in the film, that things have changed, things are different, things have changed in the period of time he's been in prison. So I don't know where Neil and Stephen got onto the idea of Bob to play the part, but I suspect it was partially influenced by knowing they wouldn't be able to secure Michael Caine for the right period of time to shoot it. But it was a change that I think made the film, because twinned with Caine, who must have been associated with it, was associated with it from the very beginning, gave a real strong figurehead, dual figurehead for the film. And although I was surprised when I watched the film how little Michael Caine appears in the film, and yet what an extraordinary presence he is within the story, with so relatively little screen time. I don't think the Michael Caine character was based on anyone in particular, except there was the idea of change, was which is within the film itself, was an element of, did have an element of a dying breed of criminality. The craze of Richardsons, all those people who came out of the East End culture, and also represented the reality that criminals had moved into prostitution and pornography and things like that in a very big way. So I think it was more based on changes within the criminal community than any particular character. Although watching the film, which some of it was shot in Soho, I'm not sure, but it looked as if in some of the sequences when they were in the strip clubs and things, that some of it was shot in the Raymond Review Bar, but I'm not absolutely certain that it was the Raymond Review Bar. And in watching it again recently, watching the film, I did think, I wondered if in some ways that they'd related it to Raymond of the Review Bar or not. The name of the Cathy Tyson character in my screenplay was Gina, and Neil changed it to something much more romantic, and I think in many ways more accurate to Simone, because a lot of girls who work as women, who work as prostitutes, do give themselves rather exotic names. And but I don't know how they found Cathy Tyson, how they cast. I put it down to the casting director introducing them to Cathy Tyson, who I think is a Liverpudlian. You can detect that Liverpool accent occasionally in what she says. She doesn't use it very strongly, but it's there. It's there. I think if I tried to place Mona Lisa in relationship to the rest of my work, is that its great value for me was the association, was the collaboration, and wherever it's possible for me to have a creative collaboration, I think I do my best work. And I've found, possibly through the isolation of being a writer, and there being long periods when I've been writing and not directing, that I've found that more and more difficult to achieve, that ongoing relationship, essentially with the producer, or in Neil's case, with the shifting relationship between him as a director and me as a writer, and then years and years later, working with him on the Borges series in Budapest, and I worked with him on both the second and the third series. And in the second series, I was both writing and directing, so I was changing functions there. And then in the third season, in 2012, I was just directing. That's all I wanted to do. I just wanted to direct. But that collaboration and the flexibility of that collaboration was there, and I think it would have been a very different experience, the Borges, if it hadn't have been essentially a Neil Jordan project. I'm not sure I know what my favourite scenes are in Mona Lisa, because it held me all the way through. I think one of the scenes that made my nails go into the palm of my hands the most was the scene when they're in the lift, in the elevator that takes them up, and when they open it, they're attacked with the razor, and he puts his arm up to protect Simone from the razor and gets cut there. That's the one that really shocked me when I saw it. And the scene, moment by moment, is from my original screenplay, but that's not why it's a favourite moment. It just really shocked me when I saw it. And just as an example, I think that kind of edge was more prevalent in my screenplay than others. I really liked what Bob Hoskins was doing in the scenes in the hotel, which were about his social incongruity and how I like the development of how she makes him more sophisticated and buys him a good suit and buys him a tie. All of that thing of how he gradually grew into the suit. It's the subtlety of that performance and the growth of that performance, which is nurtured, of the man, nurtured by the woman, which he eventually mistakes for love. Those are my favourite scenes. That's how, rather than picking out an individual scene, it's that evolution of the story and of the character that sticks for me for the film as a whole.